Psychology says if you constantly double-check things, if you go back to verify the door is locked even after you just locked it, if you reread emails 5 times before sending them, if you check your alarm 3 times before bed even though you know it's set, you're not just being careful. You're running a specific psychological pattern that has more to do with how your brain processes certainty than it does with the actual risk of something going wrong. And if this describes you, what you're about to hear will explain exactly why you can't stop checking even when you consciously know everything is fine. This isn't about being thorough. This isn't about having high standards. This is about a nervous system that has learned to distrust its own perception of reality, and that distrust creates a loop that's almost impossible to break without understanding what's actually driving it. The compulsion to check isn't about the door, the email, or the alarm. It's about trying to eliminate a feeling of uncertainty that your brain has decided is intolerable. And the more you check, the more you reinforce the idea that checking is what keeps you safe, which makes the urge to check even stronger the next time. The first thing to understand is that excessive checking is often rooted in what psychologists call intolerance of uncertainty. Most people can tolerate a small margin of doubt. They lock the door, they assume it's locked, and they move on. But people who compulsively check have a nervous system that treats uncertainty as a threat. The moment there's even a slight gap between what you did and your confidence that you did it correctly, your brain registers that gap as danger. And the only way to reduce that danger, according to your nervous system, is to go back and verify. Research shows that people with high intolerance of uncertainty experience ambiguous situations as more stressful than people with low intolerance of uncertainty. It's not that they're experiencing more actual risk. It's that their brain interprets the lack of absolute certainty as if it were risk. And checking becomes the behavior that temporarily closes that gap. You check the lock, you see it's locked, and for a few seconds your brain feels certain. But that certainty doesn't last, because the problem was never whether the door was locked. The problem is that your nervous system doesn't trust certainty even when it has it. The second pattern is that checking behavior is often driven by an inflated sense of responsibility. People who check excessively tend to believe that if something goes wrong, it will be their fault, and the consequences will be catastrophic. This isn't rational. It's a cognitive distortion that psychologists call hyper-responsibility. You believe that leaving the stove on will burn the house down, that sending an email with a typo will ruin your career, that forgetting to lock the door will result in a break-in. And because the imagined consequences feel so extreme, the urge to prevent them becomes overwhelming. What makes this particularly difficult is that the consequences you're imagining almost never happen. You check the stove, it's off. You reread the email, there's no typo. You verify the lock, it's secure. And in a normal learning process, that repeated evidence that nothing bad happens should reduce the anxiety. But it doesn't. Because each time you check and find that everything is fine, your brain doesn't conclude that checking was unnecessary. It concludes that checking is what prevented the disaster. The checking becomes the reason you believe you're safe, which means you need to keep checking to stay safe. The third thing is that people who compulsively check often have what's called an overactive error detection system. This is a part of your brain, specifically the anterior cingulate cortex, that monitors for mistakes, inconsistencies, and things that don't match your expectations. In most people, this system activates when there's an actual error and then quiets down once the error is corrected. But in people who check excessively, this system is hyperactive. It flags potential errors even when there aren't any. It treats normal uncertainty as if it were a confirmed mistake that needs fixing. Neuroscience research using brain imaging has shown that people with obsessive-compulsive tendencies, which checking behavior often falls under, have heightened activity in this error detection region even during neutral tasks. Their brain is essentially running a constant background scan for things that might be wrong, and that scan doesn't turn off. So even after you've checked something and confirmed it's fine, your error detection system is still firing, still suggesting that maybe you missed something, maybe you didn't check carefully enough. Maybe you should check one more time just to be sure. The fourth pattern, and this one is critical, is that checking provides temporary relief but long-term reinforcement. When you feel the urge to check and you resist it, your anxiety spikes. It's uncomfortable. It feels unbearable. But when you give in and check, the anxiety drops immediately. That drop feels like relief, and relief is one of the strongest reinforcers in psychology. Your brain learns that checking equals relief, and every time you check, you're teaching your nervous system that the way to handle uncertainty or anxiety is to check again. This is why checking behavior escalates over time. What starts as checking once becomes checking twice, then 3 times, then compulsively until it interferes with your ability to function normally. You're not getting more anxious because the stakes are higher. You're getting more anxious because the behavior that's supposed to reduce anxiety is actually training your brain to produce more of it. Psychologists call this a negative reinforcement loop. The behavior reduces discomfort in the short term, so you keep doing it, but it increases the baseline level of discomfort over time, which means you need to do it more frequently just to feel okay. The fifth thing is that people who check excessively often have a deeper fear that goes beyond the specific thing they're checking. The door, the stove, the email, those are just the surface. Underneath, there's usually a more fundamental fear about being responsible for harm, being seen as incompetent, or losing control. Checking becomes a way of managing that deeper fear by controlling the smaller, tangible things you can verify. It's a form of safety behavior, and safety behaviors feel protective, but they actually prevent you from learning that you can tolerate uncertainty without catastrophe. When you check the lock for the 3rd time, you're not really checking the lock. You're checking whether you're the kind of person who can be trusted to lock a door correctly. You're checking whether you're competent, responsible, safe. And because those are identity-level concerns, no amount of physical verification will ever fully resolve them. You could check the lock 100 times and still feel uncertain because the uncertainty isn't about the lock. It's about you. And until you address that underlying doubt, the checking will continue. The 6th pattern is that checking behavior often worsens under stress. When your baseline stress level is low, you might check once or twice and move on. But when you're under pressure, when you're tired, when life feels overwhelming, the checking intensifies. This happens because stress reduces your cognitive resources. You have less mental energy to tolerate uncertainty, less capacity to challenge the irrational thoughts driving the behavior, and less emotional bandwidth to sit with discomfort. So checking becomes the quickest, most automatic way to reduce one source of distress in an otherwise chaotic situation. But this creates another problem. Because checking becomes your go-to coping mechanism under stress, you never develop alternative ways of managing uncertainty or anxiety. You never learn that you can feel anxious and not check. You never build the distress tolerance that would allow you to sit with the discomfort until it passes on its own. And so when the next stressful period hits, the checking behavior returns, often stronger than before, because it's the only tool you have. The 7th thing, and this is where it starts to affect your relationships, is that compulsive checking often frustrates the people around you. They see you checking the same thing multiple times, and they don't understand why you can't just trust yourself. They tell you to relax, to stop worrying, to just believe that you locked the door and move on. And their frustration makes sense from the outside, because to them, the checking looks irrational. But what they don't see is that for you, not checking feels dangerous in a way you can't fully articulate. The anxiety isn't a choice. The compulsion isn't something you can just decide to stop. This creates a gap between your internal experience and how others perceive you. They think you're being unnecessarily anxious or controlling. You feel like they don't understand that the checking is the only thing keeping the anxiety manageable. And that gap can lead to conflict, especially in close relationships where your checking behavior directly impacts shared routines. Your partner gets frustrated waiting for you to verify the stove for the 4th time before you can leave the house. Your roommate doesn't understand why you need to triple-check that the windows are closed. And their impatience, while understandable, often makes the anxiety worse because now you're not just worried about the thing you're checking, you're also worried about being judged for checking it. The 8th pattern is that people who check compulsively often have difficulty trusting other people to do things correctly. If someone else locks the door, turns off the stove, or sends an email on your behalf, you feel compelled to verify it yourself. It's not that you think they're incompetent. It's that your nervous system only accepts certainty when you're the one who confirmed it. This is an extension of the same distrust of perception we talked about earlier, but now it's extending outward. You don't just distrust your own ability to assess reality accurately. You distrust everyone's ability to do it. This makes delegation nearly impossible. At work, you struggle to let others handle tasks because you feel responsible for the outcome, and you can't feel confident in that outcome unless you've personally verified every step. At home, You end up doing things yourself even when others offer to help because letting them do it means accepting a level of uncertainty you can't tolerate. And over time, this creates resentment. People stop offering to help because they know you'll just redo it anyway. You end up carrying more responsibility than you need to, not because no one else is capable, but because you can't psychologically afford to trust that they are. The ninth thing is that checking behavior creates a false sense of control. The act of checking feels like you're taking action to prevent something bad from happening, and action feels like control. But you're not actually controlling anything meaningful. You're controlling your anxiety temporarily by engaging in a ritual that your brain has decided equals safety. The door was locked the first time you checked it. The stove was off. The email was fine. Checking again didn't change the objective reality. It only changed your subjective sense of certainty, and that sense is temporary, which is why you have to keep checking. Psychologists call this magical thinking, the belief that performing a specific action will prevent an unrelated negative outcome even when there's no logical connection between the two. It's the same mechanism that drives superstitions. People knock on wood, avoid walking under ladders, or carry lucky charms not because these actions have any real effect, but because they create a feeling of control in situations where control is actually limited. Checking works the same way. It feels protective, but the protection is an illusion. The real function of checking is anxiety reduction, not danger prevention. The 10th pattern, and this is where the psychological cost becomes clearest, is that compulsive checking takes up an enormous amount of mental energy and time. Every minute you spend rechecking the lock, rereading the email, or verifying the alarm is a minute you're not spending on things that actually matter. And it's not just the time. It's the mental bandwidth. The constant low-level worry about whether you checked thoroughly enough, whether you need to go back and check again, whether something might go wrong because you didn't verify it one more time, that anxiety runs in the background of everything else you're trying to do. This cognitive load affects your ability to focus, to be present, to enjoy experiences. You're at dinner with friends, but part of your mind is back at home wondering if you locked the door. You're trying to work on a project, but you keep stopping to recheck something you already verified. You're lying in bed trying to sleep, but your brain won't let go of the question of whether the alarm is actually set even though you've checked it 3 times. The checking behavior doesn't just consume the moments when you're actively checking. It consumes the moments in between, because your mind is either preparing to check, recovering from checking, or worrying about whether you should check again. But here's where it becomes important to understand what's happening beneath the surface. Compulsive checking is almost always a symptom of deeper anxiety, and addressing the checking without addressing the underlying anxiety rarely works long-term. You can force yourself to stop checking through sheer willpower, and for a while it might work. But the anxiety that was driving the checking doesn't disappear. It just finds another outlet. You stop checking the door, but now you're checking your bank account obsessively. You stop rereading emails, but now you're verifying your calendar compulsively. The behavior changes, but the pattern stays the same. This is why effective treatment for compulsive checking usually involves exposure and response prevention, a therapeutic technique where you deliberately expose yourself to the uncertainty without engaging in the checking behavior, and you sit with the anxiety until it decreases on its own. The goal is to teach your nervous system that uncertainty is tolerable, that anxiety diminishes even without checking, and that the catastrophic outcomes you fear don't actually happen when you resist the compulsion. It's uncomfortable. It requires support, usually from a therapist trained in this approach. But it works because it addresses the root cause, which is the intolerance of uncertainty, not the specific checking behavior. The other component of effective treatment is cognitive restructuring, which means identifying and challenging the distorted thoughts that drive the checking. Thoughts like, if I don't check, something terrible will happen. If I'm not absolutely certain, I'm being irresponsible. If I make a mistake, the consequences will be catastrophic. These thoughts feel true when you're in the middle of the anxiety, but they're not accurate reflections of reality. Cognitive restructuring helps you examine the evidence for and against these thoughts, identify the cognitive distortions they're based on, and replace them with more realistic assessments of risk and responsibility. The final thing to understand is that if you recognize yourself in this pattern, you're not broken and you're not alone. Compulsive checking affects millions of people, and it exists on a spectrum. Some people check occasionally under stress. Some people check so compulsively that it disrupts their daily life. Where you fall on that spectrum matters less than whether the behavior is causing you distress or interfering with your functioning. If it is, that's a signal that it's worth addressing, not because there's something fundamentally wrong with you, but because you deserve to live without the constant mental burden of needing to verify reality over and over. You can learn to tolerate uncertainty. You can retrain your nervous system to trust your perception. You can develop the cognitive flexibility to recognize when your anxiety is giving you false information about risk. But it takes deliberate effort, usually with professional support, and it requires you to do the thing that feels most dangerous, which is to stop checking and sit with the discomfort until your brain learns that the discomfort passes without catastrophe. That learning doesn't happen overnight. But it does happen. And on the other side of it is a version of your life where you lock the door once, trust that it's locked, and move on. If this helped you understand yourself better, consider subscribing for more psychology breakdowns like this.